Snow drifted across the sidewalk as an elderly man held out a small tin bowl. "Just a little rice," he whispered. "Enough to make porridge." Across the street, a Navy SEAL had just returned home, walking beside his German shepherd after months away. Then the dog suddenly stopped and stared at the trembling stranger. The soldier looked closer. It was his father. Why was the old man begging when money had been sent home every month? Why had his phone calls never gone through? And what would the German shepherd discover behind the locked pantry door? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late afternoon settled over Erie, Pennsylvania, beneath a sky the color of old pewter. Lake-effect snow swept inland from Lake Erie, softening the brick storefronts along Peach Street and filling the gutters with white drifts. Daniel Carter had returned 2 days earlier than expected after nearly 10 months away. At 42, Daniel was a tall, broad-shouldered Navy SEAL with short dark brown hair graying at the temples, a neatly trimmed beard, and a hard, angular face shaped by years of sun, salt, and sleepless nights. Daniel's blue-gray eyes had learned to measure doors, windows, and distances before noticing flowers or friendly faces. The habit had kept Daniel alive overseas, but it had also made ordinary life feel like a room Daniel never fully entered. Daniel wore a dark winter coat over his travel clothes and pulled the black rolling suitcase through the shallow snow. Beside Daniel walked Ranger, a 5-year-old male German shepherd with a powerful, athletic body, thick black and tan fur, upright ears, and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little. Ranger had once worked beside Daniel during military training, and had remained Daniel's closest companion after an injury ended the dog's operational service. Ranger was disciplined, loyal, and usually indifferent to strangers, though elderly women with butter cookies could destroy Ranger's dignity in less than 10 seconds. Daniel had not told anyone about the early return. Daniel wanted to surprise his father, Walter, and perhaps spend one quiet evening in the old house before answering questions about work, danger, and how long Daniel intended to stay. Walter Carter had raised Daniel alone after Daniel's mother died when Daniel was 16. Walter had never been a man of long speeches. Walter repaired broken chairs, sharpened dull tools, and appeared at every school event wearing sawdust on his sleeves. Affection, in Walter's language, was a full gas tank and a porch light left burning. Daniel had sent money home every month since Walter retired, always the same amount, $2,500, transferred automatically into Walter's account. Rebecca, Daniel's wife, had assured Daniel that Walter was comfortable, stubborn, and still refusing to replace the ancient furnace. Daniel had believed her because belief was easier than asking questions when every phone call came between assignments. The thought stung now, though Daniel did not yet know why. Peach Street looked smaller than Daniel remembered. The bakery had become a pharmacy, the diner had lost its red awning, and the old grocery store on the corner still carried the faded sign Bay Market above its entrance. Daniel almost walked past it. Ranger stopped so suddenly that the suitcase bumped Daniel's heel. The German shepherd's body became still, ears pointed forward, nose lifted toward the opposite side of the sidewalk. "Come on, Ranger," Daniel said. But Ranger did not move. A low sound rose in the dog's throat, not a growl, but a troubled whine Daniel had heard only when Ranger sensed pain. Daniel followed Ranger's gaze. An elderly man sat against the grocery store's brick wall beneath a narrow strip of awning. Snow had gathered on the shoulders of the man's brown coat. A small tin bowl rested on the pavement before him. The old man wore a knitted cap pulled low over thin silver hair, and his narrow face had the sunken, papery look of someone who had been disappearing a little at a time. His hands trembled as he held out a clear plastic bag toward shoppers leaving the store. "Just a little rice," the old man whispered. His voice was rough and faint. "Enough to make some porridge." Most people lowered their eyes and hurried past. One woman paused, looked inside her shopping bag, then apologized and walked away. Daniel felt irritation before recognition. The man's posture seemed familiar. The slight bend in the left shoulder, the fingers curled inward from decades of gripping carpenter's tools. Daniel stared at the old man's cheek, where a pale scar ran beneath the ear from an accident involving a cabinet hinge 30 years earlier. The world narrowed until Daniel heard only Ranger's breathing. "Dad?" The old man lifted his head. Walter Carter's eyes were still the same soft hazel Daniel remembered, but fear moved through them before joy could settle. Walter looked at Daniel as though his son were both an answered prayer and the one witness Walter had hoped never to face. "Danny," Walter said. Daniel had not been called Danny in years. Daniel dropped the suitcase and crossed the sidewalk, nearly slipping on packed snow. Up close, the change in Walter was worse. Walter's cheeks were hollow. His beard had grown in uneven white patches, and his lips held a bluish tint. The coat hanging from Walter's shoulders was the same coat Walter had owned when Daniel graduated high school. It had once fit snugly. Now it looked borrowed from a larger man. "What are you doing out here?" Daniel asked. The question came out harder than intended. Anger was easier to carry than fear. "Why are you asking strangers for food?" Walter tried to cover the bowl with one hand. "You came home early." "Dad, answer me." "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding." "You're freezing." "I'm all right." Walter's old pride appeared for a moment, thin but stubborn. Daniel had seen wounded men say the same words while bleeding through uniforms. He hated hearing them from his father. A woman hurried across the street, raising one gloved hand. Grace Miller was 70 years old, small and straight-backed, with warm brown skin, short white curls visible beneath a blue wool hat, and sharp, dark eyes that had lost none of their authority after 38 years as a hospital nurse. Grace had lived across from Walter for almost 2 decades. She was practical, compassionate, and occasionally so direct that people mistook concern for scolding. After losing her husband to a stroke 6 years earlier, Grace had become more watchful of the lonely people on her street, though Walter's quietness had often defeated even Grace's questions. "Daniel, thank God," Grace said, breathless. "I called your number twice this morning." Daniel checked his phone and saw nothing. "What happened to him?" Grace looked at Walter, then back at Daniel. "Walter has been coming to my house for rice. 3 months, maybe longer. A cup at a time. He always said your transfer was delayed." Daniel felt something cold move beneath his ribs. "The transfer has never been delayed, not once." Grace's expression changed. "Then someone has not been telling the truth." Walter pushed one hand against the wall and tried to stand. "Grace, don't make trouble." His knees buckled before Daniel could reach him. Ranger lunged forward, bracing his body against Walter's side, while Daniel caught his father beneath the arms. Walter weighed almost nothing. That frightened Daniel more than the fall. "Call an ambulance," Daniel said. Grace already had her phone in hand. While Grace spoke to the dispatcher, Ranger remained beside a worn canvas bag near Walter's feet. The dog nudged it, then looked at Daniel and whined again. Daniel opened the bag, expecting medicine, a wallet, or groceries. Inside was a small plastic container holding barely half a cup of watery porridge. A strip of masking tape had been pressed across the lid. Written in Walter's shaky handwriting was one name: Emily. Emily Carter, Daniel's 18-year-old daughter, had lived with Daniel and Rebecca for 8 years. She was a gentle, thoughtful girl with long brown hair, pale blue eyes, and a habit of apologizing even when someone else stepped on her foot. Daniel stared at the label. Walter had been begging for rice while saving the little food he possessed for Emily. The ambulance arrived through the falling snow. 2 paramedics wrapped Walter in a thermal blanket and lifted him onto a stretcher. Daniel climbed inside while Grace promised to take the suitcase and bring Ranger to the hospital entrance. Walter's eyes fluttered open beneath the harsh white light. His cold fingers searched until they found Daniel's wrist. "Don't be angry with Emily," Walter whispered. "She didn't know what to do." Daniel leaned closer. "What didn't she know? Dad, what happened in that house?" Walter's grip weakened. She was afraid. Before Daniel could ask another question, Walter's eyes closed and his hand slipped away. Outside, Ranger stood in the snow beside Grace, watching the ambulance doors shut. The German Shepherd did not move when the vehicle pulled away. Near Ranger's front paws, Walter's tin bowl remained on the sidewalk, slowly filling with snow. Night settled over St. Vincent Hospital, while snow whispered against the windows. Daniel Carter sat beside his father's bed, and Ranger lay near the wall with his muzzle across his paws. Walter looked painfully small beneath the white blankets, his hollow face softened by oxygen tubing and exhaustion. Dr. Helen Park entered carrying a tablet. She was a 56-year-old physician with a compact build, straight black hair silvering at the temples, warm brown eyes, and a calm voice shaped by years of giving difficult news. A pale burn scar crossed her right hand, left from a childhood accident that had inspired her to study medicine. Helen was kind, but she did not soften facts. Walter had pneumonia, serious dehydration, and severe malnutrition. The infection could be treated, but his body had been weakened over months. "This did not happen in a few days," she said. Daniel thought of the $2,500 transferred into his father's account every month. The payments had never been late. The man in the bed proved that money could arrive exactly where it was sent, and still never reach the person it was meant to protect. Walter woke briefly and apologized for ruining Daniel's homecoming. "You're staying here," Daniel said. "I'm going to the house." Fear crossed Walter's hazel eyes. "Don't start a fight. I'm only looking. Looking becomes fighting with you." Walter knew Daniel's courage and impatience came from the same place. Daniel had spent his life entering dangerous rooms with a plan, but family pain did not obey plans. Grace Miller arrived with Daniel's suitcase and offered to remain with Walter. Ranger rose before Daniel spoke. The house on Harbor Street stood beneath a leaning maple 3 blocks from the lake. Daniel had grown up there and helped Walter rebuild the porch after his mother died. From outside, the narrow home looked cared for. The walkway was cleared, a wreath hung on the door, and warm light glowed behind clean curtains. Inside, the order felt staged. The living room smelled of expensive candles and furniture polish. Framed photographs of Rebecca and Emily covered the mantel, but Walter appeared in none. Rebecca Carter, Daniel's 43-year-old wife, was not home. She was tall and slender, with smooth chestnut hair, pale olive skin, carefully shaped features, and a composed manner that made strangers trust her quickly. Rebecca disliked disorder and public embarrassment. Daniel had once admired her ability to make hard situations look manageable. Now it felt like camouflage. A note said Rebecca and Emily were visiting Rebecca's sister in Cleveland. It did not mention Walter. Ranger moved down the hallway and stopped at the small back bedroom that had once belonged to Daniel. A thin mattress lay on a metal frame without proper bedding. Expired noodle cups sat beside an electric kettle. Empty prescription bottles lined the windowsill. The refill date on Walter's blood pressure medicine had passed 4 months earlier. The landline had been cut behind the nightstand. Walter's mobile phone rested in a drawer. Nearly every incoming number was blocked except Rebecca's. Daniel's own number appeared under restricted contacts. He remembered failed calls and messages Rebecca said Walter was too tired to return. People often accepted explanations that protected their peace. Daniel had done the same. In the kitchen, Ranger scratched at a lower oak cabinet. A new brass padlock secured the handles. Daniel opened the refrigerator. It was full of imported cheese, fresh berries, prepared salmon, bottled juices, and restaurant containers. Several boxes were labeled Rebecca. Others were marked Emily. On the bottom shelf sat a dented pot covered with foil. Inside was sour porridge, gray around the edges. A strip of tape read, "Walter, do not touch others' food." Daniel stood very still. He had witnessed cruelty in louder forms, but this quiet division between abundance and hunger felt colder than shouting. Ranger pressed his nose against Daniel's hand, grounding him before anger made him careless. Grace arrived after leaving Walter with the night nurse. When she saw the padlock, she covered her mouth. Grace told Daniel that Walter had once treated the kitchen like a chapel. After his wife died, Walter still hosted Sunday suppers for neighbors who lived alone. He made chicken stew, baked cornbread, badly but proudly, and sent everyone home with leftovers. 6 months earlier, the curtains began staying closed. Rebecca said Walter wanted privacy and had become embarrassed by forgetfulness. Grace believed her because Walter stopped answering the door. "I should have pushed harder," Grace said. Daniel understood the useless arithmetic of guilt. People counted what they should have done only after danger became visible. Ranger returned to Walter's room and pawed beneath the mattress. Daniel lifted it and found a paper bag of dog biscuits. The receipt was dated 1 month earlier. Walter had bought Ranger's favorite peanut butter treats while surviving on expired noodles and spoiled porridge. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, holding the bag. His father had expected him home. Perhaps that expectation had been one of the few things keeping Walter hopeful. Daniel carried Walter's old claw hammer from the basement into the kitchen. Grace did not stop him. He struck the padlock twice. The metal snapped and fell to the floor. Inside were rice, canned soup, crackers, oatmeal, and enough food to have fed Walter for weeks. Most of it was unopened. Ranger sniffed along the rear panel and scratched at one corner. Daniel noticed a strip of wood sitting unevenly against the cabinet wall. He pried it loose and found a narrow space between the cabinet and plaster. Hidden inside was a small blue notebook wrapped in a grocery bag. Its cover was worn, and one corner had darkened from the touch of many fingers. Daniel opened it beneath the kitchen light. Walter's handwriting trembled across the first page. If Daniel is reading this, it means Walter could no longer pretend everything was all right. The kitchen on Harbor Street had gone quiet, except for the refrigerator's low hum and the dry hiss of snow brushing against the windows. Daniel Carter stood beneath the yellow ceiling light with the blue notebook open in both hands. Ranger remained beside the broken pantry lock, the 5-year-old German Shepherd's black and tan body alert but motionless, as though the dog understood that whatever hid inside those pages was more dangerous than anything behind a closed door. Grace Miller sat at the small kitchen table, her blue wool coat still buttoned, her short white curls damp from the snow. Daniel read the first entry twice before turning the page. Walter had begun writing almost 8 months earlier. His handwriting was neat at first, the letters firm and evenly spaced, the work of a retired carpenter who believed every line deserved to be measured. Walter wrote that Rebecca had offered to keep his bank card because handling money had become too stressful for a man his age. She had smiled when she said it. Walter had felt embarrassed for being relieved. Rebecca promised to buy groceries, refill prescriptions, and pay household expenses. For the first several weeks, nothing seemed wrong. Then the Sunday roasts disappeared. Fresh vegetables were replaced by canned soup. The canned soup became instant noodles. Eventually, Walter was told that his appetite had become wasteful. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read. He remembered Rebecca's calm voice during calls from overseas. "Walter is doing well. Walter ate earlier. Walter is sleeping." Every sentence had been smooth enough to accept without examination. Daniel had always believed obvious danger was the worst kind. Now he understood that quiet explanations could be far more effective because they invited a tired man to stop asking questions. The entries changed as the months passed. The handwriting grew smaller, crowded toward the margins, as though Walter feared even paper might be taken from him. Walter wrote that his blood pressure medicine had run out. Rebecca said the pharmacy had delayed the refill, then later claimed the doctor had decided Walter no longer needed it. When dizziness forced Walter to sit on the kitchen floor, Rebecca warned him not to mention it to Daniel. She said Daniel was responsible for men whose lives depended on him and could not be distracted by an old man's headaches. Daniel lowered the notebook for a moment. The words landed with cruel precision because they had used Daniel's own sense of duty against his father. Walter had always respected Daniel's service. Rebecca had transformed that pride into a wall. Daniel remembered brief calls made from dim hallways, temporary quarters, and airport terminals. He had listened for 30 seconds, sometimes less, before another obligation pulled him away. When Walter failed to answer, Rebecca usually did. She always had a reasonable explanation. Walter was outside. Walter had gone to bed. Walter did not feel like talking. Daniel had heard what he needed to hear because believing his father was safe allowed him to keep moving. Grace watched Daniel's face as the anger inside him hardened into something quieter. "You didn't know," Grace said. Daniel did not look up. I knew he sounded tired. Old men sound tired. My father never sounded small. Grace folded her gloved hands. She knew guilt could become vanity when people made another person's suffering entirely about what they themselves had failed to notice. Still, she understood Daniel's need to count each missed sign. Grace had spent nearly 4 decades as a nurse, and she had seen relatives stand beside hospital beds asking why no one had warned them. Often, someone had warned them. The warning had simply arrived disguised as a canceled dinner, an unanswered call, or a voice saying everything was fine. Daniel continued reading. Walter had tried calling him repeatedly. The phone displayed failed call after failed call. Rebecca told Walter that Daniel had blocked the house number because repeated calls interfered with military communications. Walter did not understand enough about modern phones to challenge her. When Walter asked to visit the phone store, Rebecca told him the cold was unsafe. When Walter tried to leave anyway, she hid his boots. Later, she threatened to place him in a nursing facility outside Pittsburgh. She said she would tell Daniel that Walter was confused, aggressive, and unable to manage himself. Walter wrote that he had begun testing his memory each morning. He listed the names of presidents, measured the kitchen table, and recited Daniel's childhood address to prove to himself that his mind remained intact. Daniel pressed his thumb against the page. The image of his father, sitting alone, performing private examinations of his own sanity, filled him with a grief sharper than rage. Emily appeared frequently in the notebook. Walter described her as nervous, but kind. She slipped slices of bread into his coat pockets, left apples beneath his pillow, and once hid $40 inside an old woodworking magazine. Walter found the money and returned it, because he feared Rebecca would accuse Emily of stealing. Another entry described Emily arriving after work with a paper bag containing oranges, crackers, and a small roasted chicken. Rebecca discovered the food before Walter could eat it. An argument followed behind the closed bedroom door. Walter could not hear every word, but he heard Emily crying. After that night, Rebecca stopped allowing Emily to visit Walter alone. Walter did not blame the girl. "Emily is living beneath the same roof," he wrote, "but Rebecca has built a different kind of lock around her." Daniel remembered the porridge container marked with Emily's name. Walter had been starving and still believed the younger person needed protection first. That was Walter's greatest strength, and perhaps the flaw that had made him so easy to silence. Grace rose and walked toward the radiator near the back wall. She rested her fingers on the old iron pipe. "I heard him knocking," she said. Daniel looked up. Grace explained that on several winter nights she had heard a repeated tapping through the shared heating lines that ran beneath the neighboring houses. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Grace assumed the pipes were contracting in the cold. Once, she had even complained to Walter about the noise when she saw him near the mailbox. Walter apologized. Grace's voice faltered. "He apologized to me for asking for help, and I didn't understand that he was asking." Daniel saw tears gather in her sharp, dark eyes. Grace was not a woman who cried easily. Years in hospital corridors had taught her to save emotion until there was somewhere private to place it. Now there was nowhere private enough. The final pages covered Walter's 72nd birthday. Rebecca had not bought a cake. Walter cooked the last half cup of rice and ate alone. Later that evening, he overheard Rebecca discussing a realtor and a closing date. When Walter confronted her, Rebecca said the house would soon be sold because maintaining it was too expensive. Walter wrote that he had never agreed to sell. He had never signed a listing agreement, power of attorney, or transfer document. The final sentence trembled across the bottom of the page. Today, Rebecca said this house may soon stop belonging to Walter. Walter never signed it away. Perhaps an old man's signature no longer requires the old man who owns it. Daniel closed the blue notebook. The sound was small, but it seemed to divide the night. What had begun with a bowl in the snow was no longer only about food. It was now about the house, the missing money, the blocked calls, and whether someone had begun using Walter Carter's name as though Walter himself no longer existed. Morning came pale and windless over Erie, Pennsylvania, after the overnight storm had buried Harbor Street beneath nearly a foot of snow. Daniel Carter left the blue notebook locked inside Walter's old desk and drove toward Lakeview Community Bank with Ranger sitting upright in the passenger seat. The 5-year-old German Shepherd watched every passing car through the frosted window, ears alert, powerful black and tan body steady despite the rough streets. Daniel had slept less than an hour. Anger had kept him awake, but anger was no longer enough. Anger wanted a face to confront. What Daniel needed now were dates, signatures, account numbers, and proof strong enough that no calm explanation could make the truth disappear again. Lakeview Community Bank occupied a limestone building near Perry Square, its polished lobby warm and quiet enough to make Daniel feel underdressed in his winter coat. Linda Mercer, the branch manager, met him in a glass-walled office after reviewing his identification. Linda was a 61-year-old woman with a sturdy build, short auburn hair threaded with gray, fair skin marked by faint freckles, and clear green eyes behind rectangular glasses. She spoke carefully and listened without interrupting. 20 years earlier, Linda's widowed mother had lost money to a dishonest caregiver, and the experience had made Linda unusually attentive whenever an older customer's finances changed suddenly. Daniel placed copies of Walter's identification, hospital paperwork, and several notebook pages on the desk. "My father's been receiving $2,500 from me every month," Daniel said. "He was found yesterday asking strangers for rice." Linda's professional expression tightened. She entered Walter's account information and studied the screen. "Your wife is listed as a joint account manager." Daniel leaned forward. "Since when?" 18 months ago." Linda printed the authorization form and turned it toward him. Daniel's name appeared beneath a paragraph approving Rebecca Carter's access. The signature resembled his from a distance, but the final stroke curved upward instead of cutting sharply left. Daniel had signed thousands of documents during his military career. He knew the movements of his own hand. "I never signed this." Linda compared it with the signature on Daniel's driver's license. "Then we may be looking at forgery." The transaction history was worse. Within days of every monthly deposit, money had been transferred to an account Daniel did not recognize. The total exceeded $36,000. 2 credit cards had been opened in Walter's name and carried balances from department stores, restaurants, hotel bookings, and online luxury retailers. A personal loan for $24,000 listed Walter as a self-employed construction consultant, earning $78,000 annually. Walter had retired years ago and had never operated a consulting business. Linda found a scanned power of attorney document granting Rebecca authority to manage Walter's property, including the Harbor Street house. The document bore Walter's signature and a notary seal. Daniel remembered the final line in the blue notebook. "Perhaps an old man's signature no longer requires the old man who owns it." The records showed deliberate timing, repeated transfers, fabricated income, and carefully collected permissions. This had not begun with a single desperate withdrawal. Someone had built a system around Walter's trust, then slowly removed every door through which he might escape. Linda froze the joint access pending an internal fraud review and printed certified copies of the records. "Take these to an attorney and the police," she said. "Do not confront anyone alone. People who feel control slipping away can become unpredictable." Daniel almost told her unpredictability had never frightened him, but the thought felt arrogant now. Walter had not been harmed by a stranger carrying a weapon. Walter had been harmed through forms, passwords, groceries, and ordinary family conversations. Daniel had been trained to recognize danger entering a building. He had never been taught to recognize it sitting at the dinner table. Back at the Harbor Street house, Ranger began circling near a stack of mail beside the basement stairs. The German Shepherd lowered his nose to a folded receipt and inhaled deeply, then moved toward the basement door. Daniel picked up the paper. It came from North Shore Resale and listed assorted tools purchased for $1,200. A dark smear marked one corner. Ranger sniffed it again and gave a quiet whine. Daniel recognized the scent, too. Machine oil mixed with cedar dust, the smell that had followed Walter through Daniel's childhood. Daniel drove to the address printed on the receipt. North Shore Resale stood in an old warehouse near the railroad tracks. Inside, shelves sagged beneath lamps, fishing equipment, kitchenware, and furniture waiting for second lives. The owner, Frank Dalton, emerged from behind the counter. Frank was 74, broad through the chest despite a slight stoop, with thick white eyebrows, a square, weathered face, and a gray beard trimmed close around his mouth. A missing fingertip on his left hand came from a factory accident when Frank was 26. After that accident, Frank had opened the resale shop and developed a deep respect for tools, believing every scratch on a handle recorded a part of someone's working life. Frank recognized Daniel immediately. "Walter's boy," he said. "I haven't seen your father in months. I heard he moved away." Daniel placed the receipt on the counter. "Who told you that?" Frank's expression changed. He led Daniel toward a locked storage room and uncovered several wooden crates. Inside were Walter's drills, hand planes, chisels, measuring squares, saws, and clamps. Daniel touched the worn handle of a block plane Walter had used to teach him how to follow the grain instead of fighting it. Each tool carried a memory. The kitchen cabinets, Daniel's first treehouse, the cradle Walter built for Emily after she entered their lives. At the bottom lay Walter's claw hammer. The walnut handle had been carved with the name Margaret, Daniel's late mother. Walter had engraved it after she complained that every tool in the garage had his name, but nothing had hers. Frank explained that Rebecca had sold the collection shortly before Christmas. She claimed Walter had died after a sudden illness and said she could not bear to look at his belongings. Frank had paid far less than the tools were worth because Rebecca demanded cash that same day. Shame settled across his face. "I should have called Walter," Frank said. "But grief makes people behave strangely, and she looked convincing." Daniel understood how often harm survived because lies arrived wearing familiar emotions. Frank promised not to move or sell anything. He also kept security footage and a signed purchase receipt with Rebecca's identification attached. While Frank searched for the video file, Ranger pushed his nose beneath the largest wooden toolbox and scratched once. Daniel lifted the removable tray. Beneath it lay an old cream-colored envelope, flattened against the bottom. The handwriting on the front belonged to Rebecca. The envelope had never been sealed. Inside was a photograph of Emily at about 10 years old, smiling beside a playground fence, her long brown hair tied in two uneven braids. Behind the photograph was an unfinished letter addressed to Michael Hayes. Daniel read the first lines, standing beneath the storage room's bare light. Rebecca wrote about fear, money, and the life she believed Daniel could provide. Then one sentence stopped him so completely that even the sounds of the warehouse seemed to vanish. "Emily must never know that Daniel is not her biological father." Evening arrived over Erie beneath a low ceiling of gray clouds, and the snow along State Street had turned to slush beneath the tires of passing cars. Daniel Carter parked across from Bellwood's Italian kitchen and remained behind the wheel for several minutes. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, the 5-year-old German Shepherd's upright ears following every movement outside while Daniel held the old cream-colored letter across his knees. The sentence about Emily's biological father had not changed, no matter how many times Daniel read it.
Daniel had faced information that could cost lives, but this truth felt more dangerous because it threatened to rewrite 8 years of birthdays, school concerts, scraped knees, and quiet drives home. He folded the letter and placed it inside his coat. Emily was working inside, and Daniel did not yet know whether he was entering the restaurant as her father, her mother's husband, or simply the man who had believed a carefully arranged story.
Bellwood's was a narrow family restaurant with amber lights, red booths, and framed photographs of Erie covered in summer sunlight. Emily Carter moved between the tables carrying a tray of water glasses. At 18, Emily was slender and slightly above average height, with long brown hair tied into a loose ponytail, pale blue eyes, and fair skin that flushed whenever she became nervous. Her gentle manner made impatient customers soften without realizing it. Emily apologized too often, laughed quietly, and watched the faces of adults before speaking, habits formed by years of learning that peace at home depended on noticing moods quickly. She saw Daniel near the entrance and stopped so abruptly that water trembled inside the glasses. "Dad?" The word came naturally, but fear followed it. Daniel noticed both. A broad woman in her late 50s emerged from behind the counter and took the tray from Emily. Mrs. Carol Bellwood owned the restaurant with her younger brother. Carol had short, iron-gray hair, strong forearms, rosy skin, and a round face that looked severe until she smiled. After raising 3 children while caring for a husband with heart disease, Carol had little patience for laziness, but endless mercy for frightened young people. "Table 12 is open," Carol said, giving Daniel a measured glance. "Emily can take her break." Daniel sat at the small corner table where Emily usually served him during rare visits home. Instead of mentioning the letter, Daniel ordered fettuccine with roasted chicken. It was the dish Emily had once promised to cook for Walter when she learned enough from the restaurant kitchen. "Grandpa likes simple food," she had said. "But simple shouldn't mean lonely." Emily returned with water and sat opposite Daniel. Her fingers twisted around a paper napkin. "Mom said you wouldn't be home until next week." "I came early." "Where is she?" "Cleveland, according to the note." Emily's gaze dropped. Daniel asked about Walter. The color drained from her face. At first, Emily repeated the explanations Rebecca had given everyone. Walter had become difficult. Walter refused proper meals. Walter forgot that he had already eaten. Walter imagined people were taking his things. Rebecca was exhausted from trying to manage him. The words sounded rehearsed, but Emily's voice broke before the final sentence. Daniel placed the photograph of Walter's tin bowl on the table. Grace had taken it before the snow covered it completely. "He was asking strangers for rice," Daniel said. "He has pneumonia and severe malnutrition." Emily covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes before she could turn away. "I didn't know it was that bad." Daniel wanted to demand why she had not told him, but he remembered Walter's warning. Don't be angry with Emily. She didn't know what to do. "Tell me what you did know." Emily admitted that Walter's meals had become smaller. She had seen locks on the pantry and heard Rebecca accuse Walter of wasting food. Rebecca claimed the restrictions were recommended because Walter was confused and could leave the stove burning. Emily believed some of it because Rebecca spoke with certainty and produced printed articles about memory loss. When Emily tried to bring Walter food, Rebecca said she was encouraging unhealthy behavior. Emily had hidden bread beneath Walter's pillow, fruit in his coat pockets, and cash inside a magazine. Rebecca eventually found the money. She threatened to throw Emily out, cancel her college tuition, and tell Daniel that Emily was inventing stories for attention. "She said you already had enough pressure," Emily whispered. "She said if I caused trouble, you would choose her because she was your wife." Daniel felt shame move through him. Not because he believed he would have abandoned Emily, but because Rebecca had found enough distance in the family to make the threat believable. "Did you ever try to call me?" Emily nodded. She had called twice from the restaurant phone. Both times, Rebecca arrived before Daniel answered. Afterward, Rebecca took Emily's phone for several weeks and told Walter that Emily no longer wanted to visit. Fear had separated them while allowing each to believe the other had chosen silence. Daniel unfolded the cream-colored letter. "Do you know anyone named Michael Hayes?" Emily stared at the handwriting, then began crying without sound. The reaction answered before she spoke. Emily had heard the name when she was 11. Rebecca and her sister were arguing in the kitchen late one night. Emily heard that Michael had left before she was born, and that Daniel must never learn the truth. The next morning, Rebecca told Emily that Daniel was not her biological father. She also said Daniel's love depended on believing they shared blood. "Mom said you would leave if you found out," Emily said. "She said you would stop paying for school and forget me as soon as you had a family that was really yours." Daniel's first instinct was to deny every word immediately. Yet the shock inside him remained real, and he did not want to offer comfort so quickly that it became another lie. "I don't know what this changes yet," Daniel said carefully. "But none of this is your fault." Daniel took Emily to St. Vincent Hospital. Walter was awake when they entered, his white hair combed by Grace and his thin face less gray than the night before. He did not ask where Emily had been or why she had stayed away. Walter simply pulled the chair closer to his bed and asked, "Have you eaten supper?" Emily's face crumpled. She knelt beside him, holding the hand of a man who had saved half a cup of porridge for her while going hungry himself. Walter stroked her hair and said nothing about forgiveness because his welcome had already given it. Grace arrived later, carrying a folder. She had spent the afternoon speaking with neighbors. One resident remembered seeing Walter outside without boots. Another had heard Rebecca shouting about money. Grace had also contacted a medication delivery driver named Thomas Reed, a 34-year-old man with a thin build, sandy hair, and a noticeable limp from a motorcycle accident. Thomas remembered Rebecca repeatedly returning Walter's sealed prescription packages and requesting refunds. Grace's careful collection of small testimonies was turning private suffering into a record no one could easily dismiss. The following morning, Daniel and Emily entered the hospital's genetics office. Emily agreed to a paternity test, not because she wanted a laboratory to decide whether Daniel should remain her father, but because she wanted the secret to lose its power. A nurse prepared the sterile swabs while Walter watched from the corridor through a glass partition. Before the sample was taken, Emily looked at Daniel and asked, "If the result says I'm not your daughter, what am I supposed to call you?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came. Beyond the glass, Walter watched them in silence, knowing the truth they needed would never be printed on a laboratory page. Morning pressed a dim silver light against the windows of St. Vincent Hospital, and the snow beyond the parking lot had hardened into ridges of ice. Daniel Carter sat beside Emily in a consultation room, while Ranger waited outside with Grace. The 5-year-old German shepherd had refused breakfast and kept turning his head toward the closed door, sensing the strain in Daniel's voice even when Daniel spoke quietly. Across the desk, Dr. Patricia Moore opened a white envelope. Patricia was a 58-year-old genetics specialist, with a long, narrow face, light brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and careful, dark eyes. She had spent 3 decades delivering answers that people believed they wanted until those answers arrived. Patricia never treated laboratory results as ordinary paperwork. "The analysis is conclusive," she said. "There is no biological relationship consistent with paternity." Emily's hands tightened around each other. Daniel stared at the printed percentage, though the number only confirmed what the letter had already suggested. 0. A perfect circle with nothing inside it. For 8 years, Daniel had believed Rebecca's story. He remembered the afternoon Rebecca had brought 12-year-old Emily to his apartment, explaining that a brief relationship before their marriage had resulted in a child she had been afraid to reveal. Daniel had not demanded proof. Emily had stood near the door in a yellow sweater, thin shoulders drawn inward, clutching a backpack decorated with faded stars. Daniel had seen a frightened child, waiting to learn whether she would be accepted. He had said yes before fear could grow any larger in her eyes. Now, every memory seemed to tilt. The first school meeting, the braces, the late-night drive when Emily's goldfish died, The birthday cakes Daniel ordered from the wrong bakery because he could never remember which frosting she liked. The memories were real, but the foundation beneath them had been constructed with someone else's lie. Daniel felt grief, anger, and humiliation moving through him in waves. Then he looked at Emily. She was watching his face, with the desperate concentration of someone waiting for a sentence. Daniel understood that Rebecca had betrayed him, but the trembling girl beside him had not.
"I'm sorry,"
Emily whispered.
"I should have told you."
Daniel folded the report, slowly. "You were a child when you learned."
"I kept knowing."
"Because you were afraid." Emily's eyes filled. Daniel could not yet say the lie had changed nothing. It had changed too much. But he could say what remained true. "You didn't create this," he told her. "You were trapped inside it." That answer did not erase her fear, though it gave her somewhere to place one breath. Walter was sitting upright when they returned to his room, supported by pillows and a portable oxygen line. Color had begun returning to his face, but his wrists remained painfully thin above the hospital blanket. Grace stood near the window, her blue wool hat resting on the sill. Ranger entered first and placed his head carefully on Walter's knee. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear with weak fingers before looking at the envelope in Daniel's hand. "You got the answer," Walter said. Daniel nodded. "I'm not her biological father." Emily turned toward the window as if ashamed to be seen. Walter studied Daniel for a moment. "And are you still the man who taught her to ride a bicycle?" "Yes." "The man who stayed outside her bedroom when she had pneumonia because she was afraid to sleep?" "Yes." "The man she called when her first boyfriend broke her heart?" Daniel looked at Emily. "Yes." Walter's voice softened. "Blood decides who a child comes from. Love decides who stays when the child is frightened." Emily began crying. Walter extended one hand and she crossed the room to take it. The moment lasted less than a minute before Grace's phone rang. A court courier was waiting at the Harbor Street house with emergency papers. Rebecca had returned to Erie and filed a petition asking the county court to declare Walter legally incapacitated. The documents claimed Walter suffered from severe memory loss, paranoia, irrational refusal of food, and dangerous financial confusion. Rebecca identified herself as his primary caregiver and requested temporary authority over Walter's personal and property decisions. If granted, the order would strengthen the forged power of attorney and allow Rebecca to proceed with selling the house before the fraud investigation reached the property records. Daniel read the petition twice. Rebecca had transformed the evidence of her neglect into evidence against Walter. His malnutrition became proof that he could not care for himself. His attempts to report missing money became paranoia. His fear became confusion. Daniel had seen false reports used to obscure responsibility before, but never with such intimate cruelty. Rebecca knew Walter's weaknesses because she had created many of them. Grace sat beside Daniel after Emily stepped into the hallway.
"There's something you should know about me,"
Grace said. Her normally direct voice had become quiet. Grace explained that her late husband, Arthur, developed dementia during the final 4 years of his life. Arthur's nephew volunteered to help with bills and medical appointments. Grace was exhausted, frightened, and grateful. By the time she discovered the missing money, the nephew had refinanced their house and emptied Arthur's retirement account. Grace had been too ashamed to report him immediately. She feared neighbors would believe a retired nurse should have known better. That silence cost Grace the house where she had raised her children, and Arthur spent his final year in a facility far from the garden he remembered.
"I told myself silence protected his dignity," Grace said. "It protected the person hurting him."
She looked toward Walter's room. "I will not watch another old man disappear behind somebody else's paperwork." That afternoon, Emily asked Daniel to take her to the Harbor Street house. Rebecca's car was gone, but the bedroom computer remained. Emily knew the password because Rebecca often required her to order clothes and manage online returns. Daniel did not touch the keyboard.
He stood nearby while Emily copied files onto a clean drive, documenting each folder before opening it. The computer contained designer handbag receipts, hotel reservations, spa invoices, unpaid store accounts, and photographs from a private resort trip Rebecca had described to Daniel as a family emergency in Cleveland. More damaging were messages between Rebecca and her younger sister.
Rebecca instructed her sister to receive transfers from Walter's account, divide the money into smaller amounts, and return part of it in cash. Other messages discussed how quickly the Harbor Street house could be sold once Walter was moved into managed care. Emily read the words with a stunned stillness. Children often believe that discovering the full truth about a parent will simplify love into anger. Instead, Emily found grief. Rebecca had been the woman who braided her hair, attended school plays, and taught her how to drive. The evidence did not erase those memories. It poisoned the space around them. Before evening, the court issued notice of an emergency capacity hearing scheduled 3 days later. Rebecca's petition emphasized Walter's weakness and suggested he would be unable to attend. Daniel returned to the hospital carrying the papers. Walter read every page slowly. His hands trembled, but his eyes remained clear. Daniel suggested arranging a video appearance so Walter would not have to leave the hospital. Walter shook his head. She wants a picture of an old man too weak to speak for himself. He pushed the papers aside and looked toward the small closet where his clothes had been stored. Bring me my old Navy suit from the house. Daniel started to object, but Walter raised one hand. I stayed quiet because I thought silence would protect this family, Walter said. Now I have to speak and find out whether there is anything left in that family worth protecting. Snow fell hard over Erie on the morning of the hearing, whitening the courthouse steps almost as quickly as workers could clear them. Wind swept across Perry Square and rattled the tall windows of the county building. Daniel Carter guided Walter through the entrance with one hand beneath his father's elbow. Walter wore the Navy suit he had requested, an old wool jacket that hung loosely from his diminished shoulders. His silver hair had been combed neatly, his white beard trimmed, and his hazel eyes remained clear, despite the fatigue shadowing his face. Walter could not stand for long, but he had refused a wheelchair until the security desk. Ranger was not permitted inside the courtroom, so the 5-year-old German Shepherd waited with a courthouse officer near the lobby, his black and tan body rigid, and his gaze fixed on the doors through which Daniel had disappeared. Grace Miller walked beside Walter carrying a folder of statements. Emily followed several steps behind, pale and silent, with her long brown hair tied back and both hands clenched around the strap of her handbag. Walter was represented by David Lawson, a 54-year-old elder law attorney with a lean build, closely cropped sandy gray hair, a narrow, angular face, and a habit of lowering his voice whenever other people raised theirs. David had become an advocate for elderly clients after his mother lost control of her farm through a poorly explained guardianship agreement. The experience had left him patient with frightened families and deeply suspicious of anyone who used complicated paperwork to silence a vulnerable person. At the opposite table sat Rebecca Carter. Rebecca wore a cream-colored coat over a dark, tailored dress, her chestnut hair smooth against her shoulders and her pale olive complexion carefully made up. She appeared composed, tired, and devoted, the image of a daughter-in-law forced to make painful decisions for an aging parent. Rebecca's attorney, Martin Keller, was a tall, 60-year-old man with silver hair, a clean-shaven square jaw, and polished manners that rarely revealed what he believed. Martin had built his career by turning uncertainty into reasonable doubt. He spoke gently, even when accusing someone of dishonesty. Judge Eleanor Whitcomb entered shortly after 9. Eleanor was 68, broad-shouldered, with dark brown skin, short steel-gray hair, and thoughtful eyes behind thin glasses. Before becoming a judge, Eleanor had worked as a public defender and later cared for an older sister recovering from a stroke. She disliked theatrical outrage and preferred documents, dates, and plain answers. Rebecca's petition was heard first.
Martin described Walter as confused, medically fragile, and increasingly suspicious. He claimed Walter had refused meals, misplaced belongings, and accused Rebecca of stealing after Daniel returned unexpectedly and turned a family disagreement into a campaign of revenge. Rebecca testified that she had managed Walter's finances only because he asked for help. She said the pantry had been locked for safety after Walter left food near the stove and forgot about it. She described Daniel as angry over problems in their marriage and suggested he was using Walter's condition to punish her. Daniel listened without moving. Every distortion contained a fragment of truth made poisonous by arrangement. Walter had been weak. Daniel was angry. The marriage was broken. Yet none of those facts explained the missing money, the blocked calls, or the bowl in the snow. David began presenting evidence. The blue notebook came first. Walter's entries were dated across 8 months and showed a steady decline in food, medicine, mobility, and contact with Daniel. Bank records followed, documenting more than $36,000 transferred from Walter's account, 2 credit cards opened in his name, and a $24,000 loan based on false employment information. Linda Mercer's certified statement identified Daniel's authorization signature as inconsistent with his banking records. The power of attorney document used to control the Harbor Street property contained another disputed signature. Frank Dalton testified next. The 74-year-old resale shop owner entered with his thick gray beard freshly trimmed and his damaged left hand resting against his jacket. Frank identified security footage showing Rebecca selling Walter's woodworking tools. The video had a clear date and showed Rebecca presenting her identification. Frank's voice cracked when he repeated what Rebecca had told him. "She said Walter was dead," he said. "She said the tools belonged to a man who would never use them again." Rebecca stared down at the table. Phone records demonstrated that Daniel's number had been restricted on Walter's device. Pharmacy records showed sealed medication packages returned for refunds. Thomas Reed's written statement confirmed that Rebecca had personally handled several returns. Photographs showed the padlock on the pantry, the labels separating Rebecca and Emily's food from Walter's spoiled porridge, and the thin mattress where Walter slept. Messages copied from Rebecca's computer instructed her sister to receive funds, divide them into smaller amounts, and return some in cash. Grace took the witness chair. She described Walter asking for 1 cup of rice at a time, always making excuses for why Daniel's money had not arrived. Grace admitted she had heard Walter tapping on the heating pipes and failed to recognize the signal. "Walter did not want attention," Grace said. "Walter wanted enough food to survive without embarrassing his son." Martin suggested Grace's own painful experience with financial abuse had made her biased. Grace met his gaze. "It made me late once. It will not make me silent twice." Emily was the final witness. Her voice shook as she described hiding bread, fruit, and money for Walter. She told the court how Rebecca threatened to withdraw tuition, remove her from the house, and convince Daniel that Emily was unstable. Martin questioned whether Emily resented her mother because of a separate family secret. He began asking whether Daniel had recently learned something that might affect his relationship with Emily. Daniel stood before David could stop him. "Emily is my daughter." The courtroom went still. Judge Whitcomb warned Daniel not to interrupt again, but the judge's expression softened when Emily looked toward him. Daniel did not mention the DNA result. He would not permit Rebecca's deception to become another weapon aimed at the girl Rebecca had already frightened into silence. Walter asked to testify. Daniel helped him reach the witness chair, but Walter released Daniel's arm for the final steps. From a paper bag, Walter removed the small tin bowl and placed it on the table. Walter did not discuss every missed meal or every empty bottle. He said hunger had hurt, but hunger had not been the worst part. "The worst part was being told my son no longer wanted to hear my voice," Walter said. "I believed I'd become a burden to the boy I raised. A locked cupboard can empty a man's stomach. A blocked telephone can empty something deeper." Judge Whitcomb denied Rebecca's petition.
The court ruled that Walter understood his circumstances, could express clear preferences, and showed no evidence of incapacity. All disputed accounts and property transactions were frozen pending investigation. The records were referred to authorities responsible for elder abuse, financial fraud, forgery, and identity theft. When Rebecca began shouting that the family had betrayed her, the bailiff escorted her from the courtroom. Outside in the corridor, Emily stood several feet from Daniel. She looked uncertain whether she still had the right to come closer. Daniel said nothing. He simply opened his arms. Emily crossed the distance and held him tightly. "Dad," she whispered. Spring returned to Erie with rain-softened streets, pale green buds along Harbor Street, and the smell of thawing earth drifting in from the lake. 6 months had passed since the hearing, and Walter Carter moved through his kitchen without oxygen tubing, though he still rested one hand against the counter when fatigue crept into his legs. At 72, Walter remained thinner than before, with silver hair combed neatly back, a short white beard, and hazel eyes that had regained their patient warmth. The strength in his hands returned more slowly than the strength in his voice. Some mornings, Walter woke convinced he had heard the pantry lock closing. On those mornings, he walked into the kitchen, opened every cabinet, and stood before the shelves until his breathing settled. Recovery, Walter had learned, was not a road leading away from fear. It was the quiet practice of proving to fear that it no longer owned the house. The Harbor Street home had changed without losing its familiar shape. Daniel replaced the thin mattress with a proper bed, repaired the damaged telephone line, and installed a new phone beside Walter's favorite chair. Daniel's name occupied the first speed dial button. Grace's name was second. Emily's was third, though Emily called so often that Walter rarely needed to press it. The brass padlock had disappeared from the pantry, leaving 2 pale scratches on the cabinet handles. Walter chose not to sand them away. He said scars could be ugly, but they were also honest. The refrigerator no longer contained boxes marked with separate names. Food belongs to whoever was hungry. Rebecca entered a plea agreement after investigators confirmed the forged documents, diverted transfers, false credit applications, prescription refunds, and attempted property sale. She agreed to repay what could be recovered, surrender claims against Walter's home, and accept a prison sentence determined by the court. Daniel attended the sentencing, but felt no triumph when Rebecca was led away. He had imagined justice would arrive like a door slamming shut. Instead, it arrived quietly, carrying grief for the years wasted, the trust ruined, and the people Rebecca had harmed while convincing herself every theft was temporary. Daniel did not forgive her, but he refused to build the rest of his life around hating her. He wanted Walter safe more than he wanted Rebecca afraid. Daniel requested reassignment to a training position within driving distance of Pennsylvania. The move did not end his Navy career. At 42, Daniel still possessed the tall, broad-shouldered build, disciplined posture, short dark brown hair silvering at the temples, and blue-gray eyes of a man accustomed to responsibility. Yet the reassignment changed the shape of that responsibility. Daniel no longer treated home as a place visited between obligations. He came back on weekends, repaired leaking pipes before they became emergencies, sat through Walter's medical appointments, and learned that listening without solving anything could still be useful. Ranger came with him whenever possible. The 5-year-old German shepherd remained powerful and alert, with thick black and tan fur and intelligent brown eyes. But Harbor Street had softened some of his military dignity. Ranger still inspected every room upon arrival, then usually fell asleep beneath Walter's chair before completing the second inspection. Emily continued classes at the community college and moved into Grace Miller's spare bedroom while rebuilding a life separate from Rebecca's influence. At 18, Emily remained slender, fair-skinned, and gentle, with long brown hair and pale blue eyes that still searched faces for danger before trusting a room. Grace gave Emily privacy without allowing isolation. She left breakfast in the kitchen, asked direct questions, and never accepted, "I'm fine," when Emily's hands said otherwise. The arrangement helped both women.
Emily needed a home where affection did not arrive with conditions. Grace needed someone young enough to complain about her old radio and teach her how to silence unnecessary phone notifications. Daniel and Emily later filed an adult adoption petition. No law required it. Daniel had already been Emily's father in every way that had mattered during her childhood. Still, both wanted their decision written in names neither Rebecca nor a laboratory could alter. At the courthouse, Emily signed first. Daniel signed beneath her. Walter cried openly and blamed the building's dusty ventilation. Grace told him dust did not usually produce tears before the paperwork was even opened. Ranger waited outside with a courthouse employee, and later celebrated by stealing half a sandwich from Daniel's coat pocket. Walter recovered his woodworking tools from Frank Dalton's shop. The first time Walter held the hammer engraved with Margaret's name, his fingers trembled. He pressed the handle against his chest before placing it carefully on the workbench. The shed behind the house became a small workshop once more. Daniel repaired the roof, Emily painted the windows, and Grace supervised everyone while contributing no labor beyond carrying coffee. Walter built shelves, repaired tables, and discovered that working with wood steadied memories that words could not. Every board had a grain. Forcing it created cracks. Following it required patience. Walter wished families came with such visible instructions. From that workshop grew Sunday Table. Walter and Grace began with 6 older neighbors who lived alone. They delivered meals, checked smoke alarms, reviewed utility bills, and made sure prescriptions had been filled. Grace handled medical questions with the authority of a retired nurse. Walter repaired loose rails and stubborn doors. Daniel helped residents recognize suspicious paperwork and set up emergency contacts. Emily organized schedules between classes. Ranger became the program's unofficial inspector. During deliveries, the German Shepherd sat outside each door until someone answered. If the house remained silent, Ranger refused to leave. More than once, that stubbornness brought help to someone who had fallen or become ill. Grace and Walter developed a closeness neither hurried to name. Grace placed an extra cup of coffee near the window every morning Walter came to work. Walter repaired every chair in Grace's house, including several that had never been broken. Grace accused him of inventing problems to avoid going home before lunch. Walter claimed the chair could hide structural weakness for years. Both understood they were no longer discussing furniture. The first official Sunday Table dinner took place in Walter's restored kitchen. A large pot of chicken porridge simmered on the stove using Margaret's handwritten recipe. Daniel sat on one side of the table, no phone beside his plate. Emily sat across from him, telling Grace about a class assignment. Grace placed warm bread in the center. Ranger lay beneath Walter's feet, watching the pot with the solemn hope that gravity might finally reward him. The old tin bowl hung on the kitchen wall. Beneath it, Walter had mounted a small wooden plaque carved by hand. Call the people you love before silence answers for them. When everyone had been served, Walter looked around the crowded table. Then he carried one more chair from the hallway and placed it at the far end. No one was missing. Walter left the chair empty so that anyone who entered, hungry, lonely, frightened, or ashamed, would understand without having to ask. There would always be one more place at the table. Walter's story reminds us that some of life's deepest wounds are hidden behind clean curtains, polite smiles, and the words, "I'm fine." People do not always ask for help clearly. Sometimes they stop calling. Sometimes they lose weight. Sometimes they become unusually quiet. Love requires more than sending money or assuming someone else is watching. It asks us to notice, to listen, and to show up. Perhaps the miracle in this story was not that every loss was undone. It was that God placed one faithful dog, one concerned neighbor, and one returning son in the right place before silence became permanent. God's grace often arrives through ordinary hands. A meal delivered, a phone call answered, a door opened, or a chair left waiting at the table. Daniel also learned that family is not proved by blood alone. It is proved by who stays when truth becomes painful.
Please share this story with someone who may need its message. Tell us in the comments who you plan to call today, and subscribe for more stories of courage, mercy, and second chances. May God protect your home, strengthen your family, comfort the lonely, and bless you with people who truly listen.